Hello everyone, this is Dalster and welcome to another episode review for Dark Side of the Ring, and in this episode it talks about the life and career of Eddie Gilbert. I don't know much about Eddie Gilbert, if I'm going to be honest, but I do know that he died very young. So I'll summarize the episode first and then share my thoughts of the episode towards the end of the video. Eddie's father was Tommy Gilbert, who was a huge wrestler in Tennessee during the late 60s to the early 80s. His father was a huge influence as to why Eddie had become a wrestler. Throughout Tommy's wrestling career, he had worked with a lot of old-time wrestlers who had brawled, fought, and got themselves into bloody matches that sometimes involved drama. It was because of Tommy that Eddie wanted to be a wrestler himself. He took the long and hard-working way instead of using his dad's name to get into the wrestling business. By doing so, Eddie began his wrestling career by taking pictures at wrestling events at the age of 16. At the age of 18, Eddie would mostly hang out with his brother Doug, who was 11 at the time. It was there that Eddie would meet Jim Cornette, who also started getting into the wrestling industry by taking pictures. They were both the same age back then, as Jim had known Eddie before he had become an active wrestler. Eddie would also watch Memphis wrestling through the television screen as he would study how it was produced, as well as how the commercials were also produced and how they came on. Moments after Eddie had turned 18, he was able to partner up with his dad as they participated and wrestled at the Major League Wrestling events. The father-son duo would then become champions, as Eddie said through an interview from 1992 that he and his father would wrestle with various styles, such as smacking their opponents very hard. In one match, for example, Eddie and Tommy went to a concession stand with their opponents and threw everything around each other, such as hot dogs, mustard, and furniture. The audience thought that it was legit, since many wrestling matches usually take place at the ring. It was said in the episode that Eddie's dream was to go to WWF, as he wanted to wrestle in Madison Square Garden, New York. Then one night would change Eddie's life, as he would get himself into a truck accident. Doug said in the episode that he received a call that same night at 2 a.m. Eddie was in critical condition and had a broken neck from the accident. The doctors had told Eddie that he would never wrestle again, as his heart was partially damaged and that his neck would never heal. When Eddie had those severe injuries, he was not even 22 years old yet. Eddie refused to accept what the doctor had told him, as 3 months later he would go back to wrestle so that he would not lose his spot. Once Eddie got into WWF, World Wrestling Federation, now WWE, WWF would use Eddie's serious neck injury and had a masked wrestler allegedly re-injuring Eddie's broken neck. He would then meet with Dr. Zahorian, who was not a good doctor, because if you know about the steroid trials, Dr. Zahorian played a huge part in it, as he was the go-to doctor who would prescribe any drugs to many wrestlers. Eddie would go to him for his neck pain. During that time in the 80s, wrestlers would get bigger around the chest and wherever else there would be muscles. Many WWF wrestlers back then used steroids in order to look good, but for Eddie, it was not okay with him, as he wanted realism within his wrestling career. Eddie soon went back to Tennessee and made himself into a heel, as he would be known as Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert. When Eddie created his new heel character, he had a flashy sweater and blonde bushy hair. There was one promo of Eddie that reminded me of LA Knight, when he said in the promo, "Listen to me, boy, while I'm talking to you." A longtime friend of Eddie's named Darla said that her grandmother had told Darla that she hated Eddie's gimmick because he was so mean and dirty. His influence on the Hot Stuff gimmick was inspired by the heels that he has seen in his life, as one of them was Jerry Lawler, for example. Jerry in the 80s was a big wrestling star in Memphis, Tennessee, and was known as the Undisputed King. Inspired by Jerry, Eddie wanted to follow in his footsteps. When Eddie had gone to Louisiana, he became a booker for Mid-South Wrestling. Once he had turned 25, he would begin to book matches. As he was a booker, Eddie loved telling stories through the wrestling matches. In one match, Eddie had beaten up the Koloffs and then put the communist flag to the ground on someone, as the audience went wild and got up from their seats. During that period, Eddie had worked with wrestlers such as Sting, Dr. Death Steve Williams, Rick Steiner, and Ultimate Warrior. Then one day, Bill Watts, who was the owner of UWF back then, sold Jim Crockett Promotions to the Turner Corporations. Eddie was really disappointed as he loved UWF, as you can see from an archive clip in this episode. Once Turner had bought UWF, Eddie worked on the WCW creative team. Dutch Mantell said in the episode that being in the booking community was one of the worst things to do since the person in that committee had no control in WCW. Wrestler Ric Flair back then wanted to have a booker position in WCW, which would then cause tension within the company. He and Eddie did not work well together as Ric did not know anything about Eddie's wrestling style, nor did he know how Memphis wrestling was done. Ric got mad one day as he called Jim Cornette on the phone because Eddie had changed the finish to his match with Ron Simmons. In that phone conversation, Ric had also told Jim that he wanted Eddie out and was going to replace Eddie's position with someone else, which ended up being Jim, that replaced Eddie. Moments later, Eddie got fired from the creative committee. Jim said in the episode that he felt so bad for this as he and Eddie were very close friends and that it had broken Eddie's heart. Eddie then goes back to Memphis and tries to come up with new ideas. He thought of an idea in which he would run over Jerry for a promo. When Eddie ran over Jerry, the car went really fast. Fans thought that it was real as they would end up calling the police and reporting it as a hit and run. However, it was a wrestling storyline. Jerry actually had to tell the police that it was not real life as it was for wrestling. Some fans were not so happy about it, but that's what Eddie would do for his storylines. One fan had taken it too far as one day they had a butcher knife and tried to stab Eddie while Eddie was going to his car. Miraculously, the police were there and they arrested the guy with the knife. Eddie was ahead of his time as he would push the limits in his storylines. An example of one of his ideas was when he had a wrestler hanging by a rope from the ring, choking. As Eddie goes to different wrestling promotions, he would then get into a relationship with wrestling manager Missy Hyatt. Eddie recalled in the 1992 interview that his dad had thought that his relationship with Missy was not going to last. Doug said in the episode that Eddie's relationship lasted for about a year and a half. He then proceeded to work with Deborah Maselli, who is better known as Medusa or Alundra Blaze, and they would end up falling in love with each other. How they fell in love with each other is when Eddie and Medusa had worked together in a match against Mick Foley and Luna Vachon. They liked the way they worked together and got married for a short period of time. Medusa said in the episode that she loved Eddie's family as she said that they were very welcoming when she was married to Eddie. The marriage sadly ended because of Eddie's struggles with his body pain. Medusa recalled that during their marriage she saw Eddie sleeping on the dinner table. The same thing happened with Dutch Mantell, as he recalled seeing Eddie sleeping somewhere. As Eddie had taken more pills so that he could control his pain, he would then change into a different person that became more negative, which would lead to his marriage with Medusa ending. Eddie was keeping things from everyone, and was the one who ended up divorcing Medusa. The reason is that he wanted to protect Medusa from the wrestling business as he was dealing with so much physical pain. Eddie's life would begin to fall apart in the 90s as wrestling territories were shutting down. He ends up going to Philadelphia and joins ECW, which back then was called Eastern Championship Wrestling. When he was there, he worked with ECW founder Todd Gordon. The Philadelphia people were known to be mean, as Ricky Morton had said in the episode that they also do not like ice cream. During his time in ECW, Eddie wanted to be the king of Philadelphia, as he took wrestling in ECW to the next level. Todd said in the episode that without Eddie, there would be no ECW. Paul Heyman would then join ECW and was impressed by Eddie's booking, as heard in an audio interview from 2013. The two of them would work together until Eddie's personality changed everything as he started to take more painkillers. He became so sad and hopeless as Eddie's addiction started to worsen. Eddie's personality and addiction would end up getting in the way as he ended up leaving ECW shortly, since Paul wanted to take ECW to new heights. At an ECW event, Eddie had asked Todd if he could say goodbye to the ECW audience, but his goodbye ended up taking longer than expected. Paul was very upset by it, but for Doug, he was mad that Paul was mad at Eddie for saying goodbye. For some reason, Doug ended up throwing a bunch of stuff as he was upset. Since then, Paul and Eddie would never speak to each other ever again. even though they were best friends. ECW ended up changing to Extreme Championship Wrestling as Paul had rebranded it. As Eddie went to a hotel room, he came up with a new trend that would be known as shoot interviews, which he surprisingly started first. Eddie wanted to tell his side of the story as the interview was from 1992. After Eddie's shoot interview, more wrestlers would eventually start to follow. When Jim ran Smoky Mountain Wrestling in Knoxville, Tennessee, he called Eddie and wanted to give him a job. Over at Smoky Mountain Wrestling, Eddie had a match with Ricky Morton, and the week after, he and Ricky would have another match, but in a tag team match. After the first TV taping with the promotion, Eddie died 3 months later. It was the last time Ricky and Jim would see Eddie alive when he was wrestling. During Eddie's last months, he had gone to Puerto Rico and was said to be very excited. Over in Puerto Rico, Eddie had wrestled a bear. It seemed like things were looking up for Eddie until one day he was found in his apartment laying on his bed with earphones in his ears as he was listening to music. Eddie had died of a heart failure on February 18th, 1995. Ricky mentioned in the episode that in Puerto Rico, you do not need a prescription in order to get drugs. Even though they had divorced, Eddie still kept in contact with Deborah as he would write letters to her. In one letter, Eddie wrote to Deborah that she was a wonderful wife and had respect for her. At the end of it, he wrote that if she needed anything, she could call Eddie. Jim said that if Eddie was still alive, Eddie would have been 1 month older than Jim. He and Deborah cried at the end of the episode, as Jim was very close to Eddie, while Deborah was reading Eddie's letter. Ricky said that Eddie was the best, and that Eddie gave his heart and soul. As of today, it has already been 30 years since Eddie had passed away. Throughout the episode, Doug shows us how much Eddie loved wrestling as you see a home, not sure if it's his or Eddie's, where it is full of wrestling memorabilia. He also showed us Eddie's briefcase that he had when he was in Puerto Rico. At the end of the episode, Doug can be seen looking at Eddie's grave, as he most likely still misses Eddie. Interviewers for this episode are Jim Cornette, Deborah Maselli, Medusa, Eddie's ex-wife, Mick Foley, Dutch Mantell, Dangerous Doug Gilbert, Eddie's brother, Ricky Morton, Darla Staggs, friend of Eddie, and Todd Gordon, founder of ECW. Some facts about Eddie is that his real name was Thomas Edward Gilbert Jr., and he was born on August 14th, 1961. Eddie started his wrestling career at Continental Wrestling Association, CWA, in 1977. Eddie was born in Lexington, Tennessee, and wanted to be a wrestler when he was in the 2nd grade. Besides taking pictures, Eddie also wrote articles for newsstands and ringside magazines that revolved around wrestling. It is rumored that Eddie had missed his high school graduation because he had a wrestling match in Memphis, which he ended up losing. As his first ring name, he used his real name, Thomas Gilbert Jr., in order to pay tribute to his dad, Tommy. While he was in WWF, Eddie was in the mid-card status and was a protege to Bob Backlund. The car accident where the doctor had told Eddie that he will never ever wrestle again happened in May of 1983 during his time in WWF. Eddie also had plastic surgery because of the accident. He left WWF in March of 1984. When Eddie returned to Memphis, Tennessee, he formed a tag team with Tommy Rich and were known as Spargo's Fabulous Ones. When they broke up, Eddie had turned heel. In UWF, which was known as Mid-South Wrestling back then, is where Eddie had become Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert. As he became Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert, Eddie created a heel stable known as Hot Stuff International, which consisted of Sting, Ultimate Warrior, and Rick Steiner. The stable were then renamed H&H International Inc. after Missy Hyatt was included. When Eddie was in Jim Crockett Promotions, he was supposed to be included in the Four Horsemen, but that never happened. Eddie left Jim Crockett Promotions in April of 1990 after the promotion was renamed WCW, World Championship Wrestling. When Eddie went to Continental Wrestling Federation, CWF, he reformed Hot Stuff, Inc. During his time in CWF, Eddie had worked as a booker with Paul Heyman as Paul was the assistant. Eddie received good feedback from wrestling journalists when he was in CWF. He left CWF in September 1988 due to conflicts with the management, In the early 90s, Eddie worked in a variety of wrestling promotions such as United States Wrestling Association, Global Wrestling Federation, and Philadelphia's Tri-State Wrestling Alliance promotion. At the Tri-State Wrestling Alliance promotion, Eddie had quit the promotion in January of 1991. At ECW, Eddie and Doug were in a tag team. Eddie gave up his booker position to Paul Heyman after 6 months. Eddie's last match was actually with a bear when he was in Puerto Rico. His first marriage was with a woman named Terry. In case you were wondering, Eddie's marriage to Medusa, or Deborah, lasted for 4 months. The shoot interview that Eddie did was actually in 1994, but in Dark Side the Ring, they show it as 1992. The shoot interview is called Looking for Mr. Gilbert and is considered the first professional wrestling shoot video. When Eddie died, he had died of a massive heart attack in his sleep. His corpse was discovered by Ken Wayne, who was a wrestler and a convicted sex offender. Tommy believed that because of Eddie's car accident and using many painkillers, it could have impacted his heart condition, which was why Eddie died so soon. A wrestling event called the Eddie Gilbert Memorial Brawl was held in honor of his memory from 1996 to 1999. There is also a banner in a Philadelphia stadium that ECW was held at the time, and in the banner you could see Eddie Gilbert's banner as well as Chris Candido. Throughout his years, Eddie had a lot of accomplishments in various promotions. In Cauliflower Alley Club, Eddie won the Family Award in 2011 with his brother Doug and his dad Tommy. At Central State Wrestling, Eddie had the NWA Central States Tag Team belts, once with Ricky Romero. During his time in CWA, Eddie won the AWA Southern Heavyweight title once, the AWA Southern Tag Team belts 4 times, twice with Tommy, his father, once with Tommy Rich, and once with Ricky Morton. He also won the CWA International Heavyweight title twice. At ECW, Eddie won the ECW Tag Team titles and the ECW Tag Team Championship Tournament in 1993 with Dark Patriot, who happens to be Doug. In GWF, Eddie had the GWF North American Heavyweight title once, the GWF Television title twice, and the GWF Television Championship Tournament in October of 1991. Eddie got inducted into the Hardcore Hall of Fame in 2009. He also got inducted into the Memphis Wrestling Hall of Fame in 2017. For Jim Crockett Promotions, Eddie won the NWA United States Tag Team belts with Rick Steiner. Eddie also won numerous titles at UWF, which was also known as NWA Tri-State or Mid-South Wrestling Association. He won the Mid-South Tag Team belts once with The Nightmare, the NWA Tri-State Tag Team titles 3 times, once with Ricky Morton and twice with Tommy Gilbert. The NWA United States Tag Team belts, the Tri-State version, once with Tommy Gilbert, the UWF World Tag Team belts twice with Sting, and the UWF World Television title once. For the Pro Wrestling Illustrated magazine, Eddie was ranked number 83 out of 500 singles wrestlers for the PWI years in 2003. At United States Wrestling Association, Eddie won the USWA Heavyweight title once, the USWA Southern Heavyweight title once, the USWA Tag Team titles once with Brian Christopher, the USWA Unified World Heavyweight title 4 times, the GWF World Heavyweight title, which was also called the GWF North American Championship as it was brought over to USWA, and got into their Memphis Wrestling Hall of Fame in 1995. In the World Wrestling Council, Eddie had won the WWC North American Tag Team belts once with his dad Tommy. Wrestling Observer Newsletter put Eddie in the categories for Most Disgusting Promotional Tactic in 1983 for the Broken Neck angle and the Best Booker for 1988. As of now, Doug will be releasing a new book on his brother Eddie that will be out in May. The date is May 15th of this year. The book summarizes Doug's memories that he had of Eddie, if you guys are interested in reading it. I give this episode an 8 out of 10, as there were a lot of interesting things to learn about Eddie's life, and that it was a little emotional at the end, especially seeing Jim Cornette and Deborah crying. He seemed to overwork himself, but always had some interesting ideas that would always leave audiences shocked. Maybe he assumed that the audience wanted more. I feel like the car accident that Eddie had was sort of a wake-up call. When he had the accident, the doctors had told him that he would never be able to wrestle, and he refused to listen to their advice. In the episode, they said that Eddie's heart was like jelly and that his neck was broken, but maybe the reason why Eddie continued to wrestle was because he might have thought that this was it, and continued to give it his all until the end. It could explain his negative attitude, but we'll probably never know. He was definitely ahead of his time and did a lot for wrestling in his short life. Very sad that he died so soon. Anyways, that's all I have for this video. Thank you guys for watching, and take care of your mental health and everyone around you, and I'll do the same too. Bye guys!